G'day guys, how's it going? So in this video, we're going to start looking at functions in Rust. Now, what is a function? Well, it's essentially a building block that allows us to reuse statements and expressions all throughout our code in a way that we can call it multiple times. So that sounds like a lot. We know what an expression is already because we've gone through that. But before we get into functions, what is a statement? Well, a statement is similar to an expression. Right? With an expression, we execute some code and it returns something, right? With a statement, it's that we execute a piece of code and it returns nothing, right? I.e., line 2 on the screen here. That just prints something to the console, but it doesn't actually return anything. So that is considered a statement, okay? And we can do multiple, and we can say, let's print another line, right? Let's say print line, hello, Daryl, right? And then another print line, how is everybody? Cool. So let's say with these three statements, we wanted to call the same three multiple times in our application, right? Well, if we look at what we currently have, we would have to do something like this, right? We'd have to copy this and say, I want to call these same three things six times, let's say. You would have to do this, right? 3, 4, 5, and 6. And if I run it, you're going to see the same three things multiple times down the screen, right? Now, that's not very reusable, right? If we wanted to do it more than 6 times, say we wanted to do it 20 times, you know, how do we go through the process of addressing something like this, right? Now, we could put a for loop in and we could just repeat this over and over and over. That's one way. But that would only be useful with the for loop that's in place inside of this main, right? But what's probably a better solution is if you want to use it in other parts of your code, you're going to define this thing called a function, right? Now, we already have one on the screen here, which is the main, right? Main is essentially our entry point to our application, but it's also a function, right? But to define a function, all we need to do is just go fn and then name the function whatever we want, right? So let's say, for example, I'm going to print these three, right? So I'm just going to go print to screen, all right? So that's the name of my function. And for the moment, I don't need to pass anything to this function. So we'll talk about parameters in a minute. So I'm going to use round parentheses straight after that, and then curly braces to create the function body, right? Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take these three statements, cut it out, and paste it, right? What that means is now I can get rid of all of these, and we're going to basically do what's called a call to this function, right? Now, how we do that in Rust is within the same file, at least, you will type the name of the function. So we'll go print to screen. And then we use round parentheses to execute that call and end it with a semicolon. All right. Now, if I run this right now, well, what's going to happen is you're going to get one printout, right? So if I want the 6, then all I have to do now, which is a little bit cleaner, is execute this 5 more times. Right, so what's that? That's 6, right? And now if we run it again, well, there you go, right? We've called the same thing. Now we can take this one step further and we can use a for loop, right? Remember we spoke about for loops in the previous video. We can now do that. We can go for I'm just going to call I in 0 to 6, right? Or we can even have I be nothing and just an underscore, right? We can then just call print to screen. So what that's going to do is it's going to do 6 iterations of this loop, and it's going to call print to screen that many times, right? And now all of a sudden, we've got some reusable code in a function, right? So let's just quickly check that this still runs and does the same thing, and it does, right? So this is a very simple example of a function in Rust, but extremely powerful, right? Because we've abstracted away something that we want to call multiple times into one simple call down here. So I can even go outside the loop and say, actually, I want to do it one more time. For whatever reason, right? We can do something like this, and it will call it 7 times, right? I'm not going to count this, but just quote me on it. There's going to be 7 times that these 3 statements are called, right? In fact, I can make it a little bit easier by just removing these 2 statements now from this function, and we can see that hello world should be printed 7 times, right? And there it is. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Cool. And that's the good thing too, right? Is in the future, if you need to remove certain stuff from a function, the rest of the application will operate without change. Only this function needs to change. Therefore, the function is deemed reusable, and you would only need to change the code in one place. Right? That's the real benefit. Now, this is what we call a very simple example of a function, right? Because we have an empty little set of parentheses here, then there's nothing inside these parentheses. Now, what usually goes inside these parentheses, if you require them, is something called a parameter. All right. So basically, you can pass in, say, a number or a char or any kind of type that will be able to be passed in here. You can pass that in there, and you can use it inside of your function, right? So here's an example, right? If I decide to say function, and now we'll say print number, right? We can now specify a parameter called, say, a number, and set it to, let's say, I32, right? So that's a parameter, right? We're now going to use this value that comes in from this call, and we're going to use it in a print statement, right? So I'm going to literally go print line, and I'm going to, in a string, just print out a number, like so, right? And if I save this, I can now instead do, say, something like this, right? Print number, pass in, I'm going to set this back to I, right? I can now pass in I. What I'll also do is, let's start it from 1 to, let's say, 11, right? So now it's going to print me 1 to 10, right? That's what we want to see. So now save this and we run it. And now you'll see the numbers 1 to 10 were printed out, followed by that hello world, right? So now we're using 2 functions, right? We're using one function in a loop that prints out a number from whatever this range is, and then we're using another one. But we're passing in this I as what we call an argument to this function. So the important thing to understand is when you pass in the value in a call to a function, that's called an argument. When you are talking about the function in itself, you're talking about the parameter of the function, which in this case is a number, right? So I is the argument, a number is the parameter. That's another thing to understand, okay? So let's look at a more complex example. Let's deal with converting weight, right? Because I want to show an example of a function that returns an expression, right? Or the result of an expression. So I'm going to create another function under here, and I'm going to call it convert weight, right? And it's going to take 2 parameters. It's going to take weight, right? Which we're going to specify as an F64 because we're going to deal with floating point numbers. And then we're going to have what we call the metric unit. So obviously, when we're talking about weight, it's either kilograms or pounds across the globe. But ultimately, that's what that metric unit means, right? Now, I haven't covered it yet, but basically we want this function to return a value to the person who's calling it, okay? So in the first 2 examples, we're not returning any value. We're just printing something to the screen. Therefore, it's a function that just deals with statements, right? But like I said, I want to execute an expression in here and actually return it to the caller, right? So the expression I want to do is going to be an if expression, believe it or not, that returns a float result. So it looks a little bit like this. So let converted temp. Okay, sorry, what am I saying? I'm looking at the wrong example here. Return if, right, where if the metric unit is double equal to, in this case, K, right? So we're looking for kilos, right? Then what we're going to do is we're going to return the weight divided by 2.2, right? Otherwise, we're going to return weight, right, times 2.2. Now, if I just do this is going to look weird, right? Because you're like, okay, what's going on here? We're just dividing the weight by 2.2, right? Or we're timesing it by 2.2. So where does this return part kick in? Well, firstly, we need to flag this function as returning something. So because we're multiplying a float by another float, we can flag this function as returning a float, right? And we do that with this arrow syntax and then the type after that, okay? Now, this works because if we remember an if condition, and if else, sorry, if it itself returns a single value inside of each of the blocks, then this ultimately returns the single value, right? It's going to either return weight divided by 2.2 or weight times 2.2. And the basis of that is going to be what's the metric unit we're passing. If it's a capital K, then it's going to call this one. Otherwise, it's going to call this one. Cool? So let's actually call this just to show you that it actually works. So I'm going to call it in two different ways. I'm going to first let kilo result equal convert weight. And I'm going to pass in something in pounds. So let's just say 165. I think that's 75 kilos. And the metric in this case will be K, right? Cool. And then we'll do another one straight after that. We're going to call it pound result. And we're going to say, we'll do the reverse. We'll go 75. And I'm just going to set the metric unit to L. It doesn't really matter as long as it's not K, all right? Now, if I print out the line straight after that, sorry, 165 pounds in kilos is, and then I can go kilo result. And then we can just do the flip side of that, right? Which is 75 kilos in pounds is pound result. And I'll just change this to 75 kilos. Cool. So I'm going to just comment out the rest of this code for a second, just so we don't get overwhelmed with printing out here. But if I run this, what's happened? Could not compile functions due to two previous errors. Weight F64. Yeah, my bad. I haven't passed these in as float. I've passed them in as integers. And that's why it's complaining. Cool. Simple mistake. And now it's saying print number. Okay, yeah, these functions are also not used. So they're coming up as warnings. So we'll just comment them out as well, just to get rid of all that logging. And now if we run it, now we get the right thing, right? So 165 pounds in kilos is 75. 75 kilos in pounds is 165, right? So we used a if expression to return a singular value inside of a function. And then we had to tell that function, because if we don't do this, it's going to complain and say, well, I don't know what this is, right? We found a 64, but you're telling us that there isn't anything to return. So it's crying about it, right? So we had to add this bit in to let the compiler know we wish to return an F64 data type, right? And therefore, under that circumstance, it understands those expressions meant to be F64s, right? Or it's saying that it does return F64, but you haven't said that the function should return something. So in this case, we're able to use an if expression. Cool? And we can even put something in front of this, right? We can put a statement in front of this. We can say executing convert weight function. Right? Sorry, I've got the exclamation mark there. Cool. And this will still work because as long as the last thing inside of the function is an expression, it will return a result. If I now try to say be interesting and try and put the statement after the expression, it's going to cry because now it doesn't know where things return, right? Because this isn't the last thing in the function anymore. This could be just part of the logic. So then in that situation, I could say return 0 or just put 0, right? And now, or sorry, not 0, 0.0. Like so, right? And then that will somewhat satisfy again, except for the fact that this is no longer just returning a singular result. So now this is just got nothing to do with anything. So I need to flag it as, having a value, and it's got to assign to a variable, and you've got to go through this process once you're not making it the last argument, right? And then in this situation, it's going to complain about you not using variables, and basically it gets messy, right? So generally, if you're going to use expressions to return a result, make sure you make it the very last thing in your function, right? And then things just work out easier because Rust understands that, okay, so this if expression is meant to return that singular F64 result that you were looking for. Cool. So I'm going to end the video there, guys. That is an introduction to functions. We will revisit them in the future, but I don't want to talk too much about that now, otherwise this video will be too long. So thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all next time.